Yeah, okay,
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Emily Lewis-Edwards, and I'm the co-CEO of Community First Oxfordshire. And I'm also here in gallery view with my colleague and co-CEO Tom McCulloch and our speaker for tonight, Will Hutton, the reason why we're all here. Firstly, thank you all for joining us this evening. This is our first Centenary webinar, and we have Dr. Freddie Otto speaking about climate change tomorrow, and the Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds talking about housing on the final night. We are, of course, here to listen to Will Hutton, and even I want myself to hurry up now, but I'd like to give you a sense of Community First Oxfordshire and why we're holding 3 webinars this week. CFO is a community development charity, and we help communities and individuals identify issues that affect them and to find their own solutions, whether that's in planning and community planning, housing, social action, or community services. We are the first, CFO is the first rural community council to be set up in England, and there are now 38 of us forming a national acre network. And when I say acre, I don't mean a unit of land. It's an acronym for Action with Communities in Rural England. But it was this week, the 8th to be exact, in 1920, that Oxfordshire Rural Community Council came to being. And back then, CFO had an improving mission, so to speak, which meant bringing literature, art, and books to rural communities. Communities which had otherwise been dismissed as impoverished, and people were too busy working the land or in manufacturing to have any interest in or aptitude for art and literature. They're just country folk. So with CFO's origins in taking education, books and art out of Oxford into the Shire, it seems fitting in for our centenary to host online talks with experts on big issues that affect us all, and hopefully, albeit it'll be limited, but time to explore how we can collectively deal with them. Tonight's theme is very current, unfortunately. It's coronavirus and the economy. 2 very, very big interconnected issues for which we still don't know what the true impacts of either will be. But on a positive, and we like to focus on this, and I particularly like to flag it up whenever I can because it's one of the few positives to the pandemic, was the surge in community and neighbourhood action, particularly at the outset. People looked on their neighbours, countless mutual aid groups formed, and this all happened organically without a lead from the government or from local authorities or from the third sector at that point. Without this organic local action, without neighbourly support, the impacts of the pandemic could have been much worse for people. It's this grassroots action over this period which has been consistent despite inconsistent top-down messages and actions that we've seen so far. But before I hand over to Will, it's time for me to talk webinar logistics. Will is kindly going to be speaking for about 20-30 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time to ask questions afterwards. If you have a question or a comment, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can do this at any time. Tom will keep an eye on what's coming in and will pose these questions to Will after his talk. We will close the webinar at 8 o'clock. But now it's time for me to excitedly introduce Will Hutton, and we're very lucky to have him speak tonight. He's a political economist, co-chair of the Purposeful Company, an Observer columnist, and last but not least, he's the author of a number of best-selling books on political economy and business. So get your questions and comments ready. Over to you, Will.
Okay, here we go. I'm just going to bring up my talk. And here we go. Just bear with me another second. Yeah, I mean, just to get going, I mean, what I'm going to do is 4 things. I thought I'd say a few words about COVID. Everyone's got their views on this, but I think it's worthwhile just thinking through where we're likely to be. And I want to introduce you to the K factor, which I think is very important. I want to discuss the impact of Brexit and how these 2 things, Brexit and COVID, are coming together in a perfect storm, and they're likely kind of impact on the economy. and some of the structural change which I think are accelerating. And then I'll say a few words about Oxford and Oxfordshire. But I think the most interesting thing is not going to be what I say, is actually your questions, because there's so much, there's such a huge panorama, everything from, the fact that Oxford is the most unequal city in the UK in terms of how it's the least affordable city in the UK in terms of house prices. House prices are 17 times average incomes in Oxford. It's astonishing. The Arc and the Expressway and all of that. Is there going to be a Cotswold boom with the new white paper on devolution and local planning coming out in 2020? How do we lock into the green agenda in all these circumstances? So there's big things to talk about this evening, but I'll just kick off with a few words about COVID. I think I've just been parachuted out of Hertford after 9 happy years, Hertford College, which I was the principal, and I've been watching firsthand the university trying to wrestle with this COVID. And I think the one of the things that I've been more and more interested in is that everyone's heard about, you track the infection rate, the 7-day average, the tragic death rate. We all look at that. We all look at is it above 1? What are the deaths per 100,000? Because that's going to affect whether you can go to Italy or Portugal or not. And what we don't talk about, and which I think is one of the most important features of the disease, is something that epidemiologists call the K factor, which is that the disease tends to cluster, and there are hot spots where it gathers. And those hotspots tend to be areas where there's a lot of human intermingling, in areas where there's poor ventilation. A hotspot could be a college like Hertford, where the K factor is very high. It could be a pub. It could be a football ground. It could be a house in multi-occupation. Of course, it's not outdoors, because there, the K factor falls right away. And one of the things that I think we haven't been discussing as a country really, is how that kind of affects one's strategy. Because I think once you start to recognize that the K factor is kind of as fundamental as the R factor, what you want to do is you want to be able to, you want to get at the hotspots fast, and that's a test and track, a test and tracing and tracking regime, local, is imperative, because that's where you get a chance to get hold of where these kind of local hotspots are, where the K factor is kind of rising. We haven't got it, of course. It also allows you to accentuate the point that actually, for those of us who are over 60, and that's me, then you've got an underlying health condition. Your shielding can be a bit more sophisticated than just staying in terrified. What you must do is go nowhere near anywhere where the K factor is likely to be significant. And we need measures, and you need to really shield people from who've got underlying conditions from all of that. What this adds up to is that we're far away from having an effective strategy to combat COVID at the moment. It's neither the Swedes with their herd immunity strategy, nor is it really an effective test, track and trace system like the Germans with their kind of, with their locally embedded capacity to do things. And we have an unfortunate hybrid in Britain where we're at the moment getting the worst of all worlds. It may be, to strike a note of optimism, Emily, because I know you like to be not too pessimistic, it may be that actually we do get a vaccine in the first quarter of next year, in which the Jenner Institute in Oxford will have played a really important role. My expectation is that one way or another, by the end of next year, we will either have herd immunity amongst a critical mass of the working population, and or a vaccine, and or effective testing, tracking and tracing, and better drugs, of which President Trump is pioneering at the minute. And I think that by the second half of next year, and certainly the fourth quarter of next year, in other words, more than a year away, I think we'll be starting to return to normal. That means that the economy is going to have its worst recession really in living memory. I mean, already it's clear the GDP will fall 10% this year. It will recover, and you will wake up in 2 or 3 weeks' time to news that the third quarter, which is that's July, August, and September, and they report that figure in the, I think you'll find it's the third week of October. And having fallen by 20%, the economy in the second quarter, or was it 19.8%? In the third quarter, it's going to have risen a record amount, maybe as much as 15%. And then that growth will tail off in the fourth quarter as we get these progressive lockdowns. I mean, something approaching a quarter of the country, a third of the population are now in some form of lockdown, and more than half in the north of England. And so the economic dislocation will be very severe, I think, there. I think there'll be some recovery in 2021. It won't be until 2022, a full 2.5 years after COVID was kind of first spotted, that we're going to get back to the levels of GDP then. And there's going to be a huge overhang of debt. And there's going to be, there will have to be tax increases to narrow the deficit. And what this implies is that unemployment, and nationally, I think Oxford, by the way, is a very special case. We are one of the richest counties in the country, with one of the lowest unemployment rates. But even in Oxford, I think unemployment is going to rise. Nationally, I think unemployment is going to rise to between 7.5% and 10%, maybe even higher. That's just in round numbers. That's the lowest end of that is 2.75 million. The highest is 3.5 million, and it could be worse. I think there's going to be a real explosion in insecure jobs of the type that we've been familiar with over the last kind of 10 years of the gig economy and working from home and actually bidding for work. There's a new phenomenon called crowd working, which some of you may have come across, in which multinationals from around the world say, we have 20 hours of work, what do you bid to do it? And the lowest bid gets the little mini contract, and it drives a coach and horses through the minimum wage. People are working for £2 or £3 an hour on these crowd working contracts. And I also think there's going to be an explosion of youth unemployment. I mean, I think there's almost no circumstance in which youth unemployment will not be as high as, it'll be as high as 750,000, and it could go through the million barrier. That's 16 to 25. That's everyone between 16 and 25. Unemployment could be as high as 1 million. And that has phenomenal and tragic effects on people's life chances. And we know from the recessions in the 80s, and again, the one in 2008-9, that if you don't get a job as a school leaver, as a university leaver, or if you're made out of work very quickly and are then out of work for 6 months, 12 months, that has what's called, the economists call a scarring effect, which you can still detect 10 or 15 years later, that your employment prospects are, and your earnings are less than they would otherwise have been. That is actually COVID, but overlaid on that, we have Brexit. Now, I think there was a risk 6 weeks ago that Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, a band of 3 brothers, really bonded together by their victory in Leave, and their feeling that they took on the British establishment and liberal establishment and won, and that they're the true believers, and they're the architects of Britain's future success. I really think they were prepared to have no deal. But I now think the politics in the Conservative Party and the country at large, and in British business, is really compelling Johnson to have some kind of deal. I thought it was very important that it looks as though something is emerging on fisheries. And of course, we struck a deal on state aid with Japan, and even the Canadian deal that Johnson says he wants to invoke has a state aid component to it. So I think there will be a deal. But here's the point. No one should believe that the deal is anything but tragically inadequate. in terms of access to European markets compared to what we currently have. Whether it be and in high-tech industries and in education, business services, professional services, many of the kind of jobs that I expect people on this webinar do, the prosperity of your sector and the companies that you work for has been built upon access to European markets. That will actually shrink because you won't conform to their regulatory standards. There could be a lot of dislocation, actually, even with a deal of kind of road hauliers having to fill in very, very lengthy forms. I've just joined the Centre for Economic Performance and the School of Economics, and they estimate that the 10-year effect of the kind of deal that we're likely to get is a 8% decline in GDP, below what it otherwise would have been. And the impact of COVID is, on top of that, a 7.8% decline of GDP. So British GDP in 10 years' time is going to be 15 or 16% below what it would otherwise have been. In other words, the economy was growing at around 2% per annum. Almost all that growth won't happen. We're going to go in for, it's going to be 10 years of economic stagnation with some bright spots. And I have to tell you that I think Oxford and Oxfordshire is going to be one of the brighter spots. I mean, over the last, since 2006, Oxfordshire has grown at 4% per annum. So, if in 10 years' time, that would have meant the economy would have been half as high again as it is now. And if it's going to be 15% smaller, most of you won't notice because it'll just be 35% larger. But that won't be the case in large parts of the north of England and the Midlands, the kind of red wall seats where I think things are going to go backwards. So, I mean, and already you can see this. I mean, Oxford was doing very well. Oxford University was doing very well on research, and actually British multinationals were doing phenomenally well from the Horizon 2020 program. And there was a piece of research published yesterday by the Erasmus University in Holland, showing that actually over the last 4 years since we voted to leave the European Union, the number of collaborations which British companies have been involved in on frontier research projects have halved from 16,000, the run rate in 2016, to 8,000 now. I mean, so we are really, our economic structure is really being damaged by Brexit. What about the change to our economic structure and caused by COVID? Because over and above this kind of picture of growth being, the cumulatively growth being much lower than otherwise have been, there's lots of other things going on. I mean, first of all, I mean, we're staying at home. Everyone knows that. I mean, you're all at home watching this webinar. I mean, had it been in normal times, I'd have been trying to speak to you somewhere in Oxfordshire, I imagine, physically, and I'd much preferred that to doing this. But cinemas are closing. I mean, Cineworld closed just yesterday. All around the country, independent art house cinemas are closing. You only have to walk down any high street, you can see the closure boards. It could be betting shops. It can be restaurant chains. Some of these shopping centres, Westfield. I mean, what future has that got? I mean, and I think the boarded parts of that are going to remain boarded up. So there's a big change happening there, and of course, with that comes employment prospects badly affected. Education moving online. I'll discuss that. We may want to take that in the Q&A session because I'm already aware it's 7:20 and I want to leave lots of time for Q&A. I do think I'm not one of the people who argue that all work is going to suddenly be done from home, nor do I think it's desirable. I think that any great company does require to create a working culture, shared values, and you need to know who your teammates are, your workmates are. You need to get to know the quirks of your boss. And I think what's likely to happen is actually we're going to not have so much a 5-day week, but a 3+2 week, 3 days in the office or the factory and 2 days working at home. And that'll be staggered to allow lots of social distancing so that K factor, which I talked about at the beginning, can be very low. So you don't get these hotspots where you get lots of intermingling. And that's going to mean that there's going to be, I think, a lot of interest in not living in city centres. Now, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Oxford is the least affordable city in Britain, where average house prices are 17 times average incomes. Indeed, the area just south of between Summertown and St John's College and the old parsonage, that area there, and particularly the Banbury Road side rather than the Woodstock side, the price per square metre is actually more expensive than Belgravia and Kensington and Chelsea. This is some of the most highest priced real estate in the world. And I think that people are going to quail and they're going to want to buy houses actually in the pre-Cotswolds and in the Cotswolds. And I mean, already you can see that trend. I mean, and I think the new this new what's it called, the devolution and recovery white paper, which is really going to require obviously what Emily and what Community First say about this, but I mean, Oxfordshire and Oxford City are going to have to earmark designated areas of land which they believe are developable. And once they're designated as developable, they can be developed. And, you know, protections that, you know, many Cotswold towns have had for their beauty, you know, are going to be quite tricky to preserve. And there could be raises a whole Pandora's box, because on the other hand, you know, we do want affordable housing and people do want to live in the Cotswolds. How to manage that in a way that's going to be tolerable? Big question, I think. Transport, I think people are going to use public transport is going to be very difficult to revive, and I think we're going to be. I do think that there's going to be a huge growth in taxis, robotic buses, self-drive automobiles, car sharing, carpooling. People are going to want to travel into work on the 3 days they go into work in a safe environment. The big acceleration, I think, in tech. I mean, we've already seen that. I mean, and already, I mean, Oxford. I mean, Oxford University has now running at two high-tech startups per month the last couple of years, and they're aiming to double that. And I think they will double it. The demand is extraordinary. And I think there's every chance, providing that the financial ecosystem can be structured and Oxford can find a way. It's rather cleverly done a deal with Berlin University. So it has physical buildings and people in Berlin, allowing it to join in with other European universities to bid for research monies from the European Union. So they're hoping to sustain the university's research presence that way, as well as the increase in research monies that the British government is promising. So I've got very optimistic actually about the university's capacity and the university's capacity to carry on generating spin-outs. But it has to be done, I think, in a systemic way, because there are dangers. I mean, BMW. I mean, big employer in the south of Oxford. It wouldn't surprise me if BMW doesn't disinvest. We've got Harwell. I'm on the board of the space catapults. I mean, we're very worried about, because the space industry is one of the growth sectors in Oxfordshire. We're very worried about whether the European Space Agency, the UK Space Agency will carry on working as closely together as they need to. So I am, you know, there are within this optimistic picture, you can see how if our growth rate in Oxfordshire has been 4% per annum, how it could easily be 2.5% per annum, you know, losing that 1.5% over the next 10 years. And you can see kind of where those kind of pressure points are going to come. But I mean, don't be gloomy. I mean, we've got, I mean, I think it's going to make the arc, I mean, the Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes link strategically for Oxford and actually for the country, I mean, really important. I mean, we have, you know, this country has a GDP of just under £2 billion. But I mean, these two towns, Oxford 100,000 people, Cambridge 100,000 people, and Milton Keynes 100,000 people, we generate about 120 billion pounds worth of GDP between us. I mean, it's really, extraordinary that these three small towns kind of do 6-7% of British GDP. I mean, and also it's the high tech stuff, and it's going to want to look north. It's going to want to look. People are going to want to commute in. If you're in Cambridge from Peterborough and Lincolnshire, and if you're in Milton Keynes from Northampton and north, and if you're Oxfordshire, Birmingham, and people are going to want to come and find work in our towns, and there's going to have to be facilities for people to kind of live here. Although of course in the 3+2 environment that may not be such a kind of a pressure, but I do think that's the pressure from government to kind of make the arc happen, and all the interconnections along that kind of corridor. It's such important. I mean, it's really one of the most important potential growth clusters in Europe. And I know that people kind of up more and around there are very resistant to it. But one way or another, I think it has to happen. Just we need the jobs. So I kind of round off. I think that, so what are the kind of winning things? What are the losing things of the next term? What are the opportunities? Well, let me I always think it's best to finish on an upbeat note so that you can all feel happy when I finish. So let me do the gloomy things first and the upbeat things second. I mean, I do think one of the gloomy things is the great rise in youth unemployment. And we have to recognise that actually Oxford City and Oxfordshire have acute deprivation. And actually I'm trying to get, Emily might want to talk about this in the Q&A session. I'm trying to get what I call a National Youth Corps off the ground. It's modelled on what Roosevelt did in the 30s. But the idea is really to have a youth-led kind of institution that puts together all the disparate bits. You know, the Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister today talked about the JETS program, or kind of New Deal on apprenticeships. There's the Kickstart program. You pull all this together, and also get people to come forward with offers of work, and actually to make sure that they're decent work and actually lead somewhere, and actually act as an instrument of social mobility and reach into these areas of deprivation in places like Oxford, where actually it is so acute. So that's one really big challenge. Another big challenge, I think, is people are going to, this devolution and recovery white paper and the likely continued economic growth in Oxfordshire, notwithstanding the wider slowdown for the country, is going to place immense demand and immense pressure to build in areas of extreme beauty. And we're going to have to think about, are there ways we can landscape these buildings? Are there ways that we can, are there areas where we want it to focus and leave other parts unscathed? How do we want to see the Cotswolds develop? Do we want the A40 between Cheltenham and Oxford to become a dual carriageway, for example? These are big challenges, I think. So there's also an education challenge. I mean, we do have very poor performing schools, paradoxically, in Oxford, and actually in the county, the performance is below the national average. And are there ways in which we can use the boom in online learning to devise ways in which we can improve the pupil experience? Are there ways in which we can get the two great universities, Brookes and Oxford, to kind of key into our particularly our secondary school network? Those are some of the downsides. But the upsides are, Oxford is likely to become, notwithstanding COVID and Brexit, and it's a tragedy because certainly without Brexit, this would have happened. But I think Oxford with its housing, the world's #1 university, and certainly Europe's #1 university, undisputed. Cambridge is a bit of a gap opened up between us and Cambridge. That is an absolutely incredible asset. And I speak as an ex-head of house, but I do know the community of people who run these colleges, and they're very, very keen and keenly aware the gap between town and gown should be narrower, and actually very anxious to put their shoulder to the wheel of doing things for Oxford. And when my colleague Jan Royal, who's the principal of Somerville, is the woman who's been chairing this inclusive growth seminar, and the paper's going to be published in the next 6 weeks. You're only pushing at an open door. So, I think that, and lastly, you talk to, I've introduced as Little Economist. I am the high priest, as you all know, of stakeholder capitalism. I'm a great, and I do think that we could if we chose, Emily and her team, kind of the LEP, the university, the startup community, we could, if we chose, really actually be pioneers in actually trying to develop companies and startups which actually do understand that their mission on Earth is to, in one way or another, make the world better, to be inclusive employers, to take the responsibilities to the communities in which they trade really seriously, and actually to kind of improve the working environment and the lived experience of those of us who kind of live and work in Oxford. So, I think there's lots of opportunity. There's lots of things also to worry about. Thank you very much. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Will. Before we go on to questions, please, if you did come in later on, please use the Q&A box, put in your questions now. And we've got at least 20 minutes to go through all of the questions. But before we do that, I do have a question myself, and it's a huge themes you're talking about here. So incredibly thought-provoking. But I'm going to go immediately to the gloomy, because I did say pretend to be positive, but really I'm a pessimist. But actually, I'm overwhelmed by, and I think you mentioned this in one of your articles, how actually it really is for 18 to 25-year-olds, they are going to be acutely affected and are now. And obviously you've mentioned the youth call, which I think would be great. But is there a piece of advice or something for a young person who's trying to make a life for themselves in this current situation? I know that's a really difficult question to start off with, but it just seems quite dismal if I was a young person right now.
I think three things really. First of all, I was, when I was brought up in the shadow of, potential nuclear war in Cuba, the kind of hyperinflation or potential hyperinflation of the Yom Kippur War. Every generation lives through shitty things. I give you that. This is pretty on the Richter scale. This is top of the. But I do encourage young people not to try to think that they haven't uniquely drawn a short straw. That other generations have had bad stuff to deal with. My parents in the war, in the Second World War, for example. So I do think keeping your morale up and not allowing yourself to get into a kind of downward vortex. The second thing is, I didn't discuss this, but I do think there is an avalanche of loneliness in our societies, and you must encounter it in your daily work, both of you. One of the worst things I think about this is it's true for older people and for the very old, but it's straying to the younger people. And I do think that, you can use kind kind of online communities and social networks, less destructively, and more to create communities in which you don't feel lonely. And actually, there are invest in yourself to the extent you can. I mean, whatever skills you've got, try to invest in them. And again, that's a fairly hopeless if you've got no resource whatsoever. But there are even local libraries, there are people out there where you can find out information. Yeah. And lastly, I'm going to try and get going a Jarrow to London bicycle ride of under 25-year-olds the autumn of next year, when I hope the COVID has receded, in which I really want to put on the map that young people need to be heard. Mm-hmm. And I want to create a social media campaign for them. I think for too long, actually, we've really neglected. I mean, the way we treat our kids is shameful. We don't curate them, we don't look after them, we don't find places for them to play. We find that the world of work is extremely hard for them. I just feel the way we create, where we curate our young people is just not good enough, and it's been thrown into sharp relief by COVID. Yeah. And I'm going to try my little best to do what I can.
Great. Thank you, Will. Okay, Tom, did you want to go through the Q&A box? I think you probably got questions yourself.
Yeah. There's some questions coming in. Quite a few actually. Thanks very much for that, Will. It's a fascinating whistle-stop tour through some big themes there. Yeah. Circling back to where you started talking about COVID-19 and immediate impacts and medium-term impacts and whatnot. A couple of questions about that. To what extent has the reduction of local authority power and influence in recent decades contributed to the country's ability or lack of ability to handle a pandemic effectively? And just linked to COVID again, the K factor, which I think seems to be quite a new concept to a few people watching in tonight. So somebody's asking, where can I read more about the K factor, and why has there not been as much publicity compared to the R factor? So
yeah, I mean, I came across this K factor. I will send you a link to an article in the Atlantic Monthly, which if you want to. I'll do that after, and you can distribute it. And you can distribute it. I mean, and I'm going to start tweeting about it too, because I think it is very, very important. So yes, I mean, you can also Google it. I mean, the K factor. I mean, I don't know whether people have read the extracts from, or even bought Sasha Swire's remarkable book, Diary of an MP's Wife, kind of ringside seat at the Cameron government and the relationship between Cameron and Osborne. But I mean, what's extraordinary about it is, I mean, these boys, and it was, I mean, they were a couple of, I don't know, they were so inexperienced and so kind of distant from. I mean, they were Tory boys from Nottingham, from Notting Hill, and I mean the frivolous way in which austerity was dreamt up, and then the impact of the cumulative cuts. I mean, between 2000 and 2020, because the cuts are still rolling on. I mean, they're not quite as severe as they were. But I mean, the cumulative cuts in local government budgets exceed 50%. And, that hasn't been done on Earth. I mean, the scale of emasculation, I mean, it certainly has been done in an OECD country since the war. I mean, no OECD country has actually so shrunk its local government sector by that degree, over that speed, over that short time. And that has left, I mean, given that there are certain statutory requirements in local government to do certain kinds of things, notably provide care, it's meant that things outside that, like public health, have just been stripped to nothing. So the public health capacity of British city and local government entering this pandemic, was, I mean, when you look at the structures in Germany, just not only did we have a fraction of the woman power or manpower in these kind of in local authority public health capacity, but actually there wasn't the software to back it up. I mean, what we've developed in this country is a highly centralized but hollowed out centre. So it's very powerful, our centre, but it's hollowed out and curiously rather dysfunctional. And at the same time, it's sapped away kind of the capacity to kind of create data locally, because it's all managed centrally, but dysfunctionally at the centre. And that's why these 16,000 cases, I mean, that's unbelievable that 16,000 infected people, weren't contacted. And then now figures have ranged now about 50,000, don't they? I mean, it's that is having the centre contracting out to Serco in particular, but also D4S, and their computer systems not going to talk to each other, not being compatible with Public Health England's computer system, and in the gaps, these vast errors taking place. Meanwhile, the data is not in the hands of local government, and even if it was in the hands of local government, the actual numbers of people kind of trained up and equipped to kind of do something with it is tiny because of the decade that's preceded us. So that, attempting to do something about the way the R factor and the K factor interlock in an English context, you start, so far behind the starting line. It's just breathtaking. And actually, I think Starmer and his cabinet would have been a better, or even Theresa May and her cabinet would have been better than Johnson and his cabinet. You're very struck at how, I'm sorry to be, you must excuse me. I am a Remainer, but I've increasingly come to think that actually, if you believe passionately in Brexit, you must almost be definitionally incompetent. I'm sorry to be, that's red flag to a bull for some of our people on the webinar, but I do think, actually to turn one's back on the single market and customs union and imagine that a trade deal with Japan is going to compensate, you've got to be silly to think that. And it's that kind of intellectual kind of spectacles and prism through which this pandemic has been handled. But the basic structures to do it weren't there, even had we had a more competent central government.
Thank you, Will. We've got actually quite a few questions to get through, and we've only got about 10 minutes.
Okay. No more long answers, okay?
No.
Well, actually, just linked to what you were saying there, Will, the ideological prism, that public policy has been looked through for a number of years now with austerity in mind. A question coming in about what policies do you think this government will use? Do you think this government will use the shock of COVID, if you like, I guess Naomi Klein's idea of disaster capitalism, use the shock of Brexit and COVID to push through things they might not necessarily have been able to get away with up to now?
Well, actually, I think the contrary. I think the shock of COVID and Brexit together with the kinds of impact on the world of work I've described, in particular on employment and for young people, is creating a witch's brew. A witch's brew in which I think it's going to be very difficult to get through controversial legislation. I'm not sure that Johnson himself will survive another 12 months in government. And I know insiders who think that by February, he will have, in order to try and give his government a new look, in order to save himself, he will sack Cummings. So I think that I think interestingly, you have a directionless government that would like to do things, but actually the political base to do it is disintegrating because of the impact of these three interrelated things: COVID, Brexit, and mass unemployment.
Interesting.
It's really, Anyway, there's more questions, so we shouldn't do it. Others have got questions, but I'm sure they're keen to have answered. I can't.
They are. They're very keen.
Okay.
And well, just linked to what you've just said there, Will. So somebody's asked them, how do we fix all this? I mean, cross-party war cabinet style of government. I guess it links back to what you were saying earlier in some ways about, reinvigorating stakeholder capitalism and developing alternative political vehicles to deal with these massive issues. What's your take on what's needed to navigate a way through this?
Well, I think I think if there's a second lockdown and GDP goes down 20% in, say, the first quarter of next year, I think Johnson won't be able to continue in office. I mean, he just won't. And I think there could be a call for a government of national unity in those circumstances. And I think you could see Sunak as Prime Minister and Starmer as his deputy. What likelihood is that? I mean, an epidemiologist will tell you what the chances are of the disease kind of getting out of control and there having to be a second lockdown. I'm not equipped to, make that judgment. I'm hoping that the partial lockdowns and the social distancing and us all washing our hands frenetically and all the rest of it is going to work. But it doesn't look good at the moment. And what do I think has to happen? I mean, I think that we have to have. We have to try and reproduce in British terms, and it has to be in British terms, the kind of institutions that have provenly worked elsewhere, and they provenly. We know 2 or 3 things. We know that from the German model, you have to empower the local. And the local have to be in control of the data. The local have to have the capacity to, react to those hotspots where it's evident that the virus is taking off, and do the appropriate things locally. That's one thing. And a second thing is that you have to have a kind of a system of such trust in central government that actually people do what the authorities say, and actually they do in New Zealand, because they trust the Prime Minister is trusted, and actually New Zealanders broadly do what central government says. They don't do that in Britain, and they don't seem to do it in America. They do it in Germany, and interestingly enough, I mean, there's a legitimacy in Sweden which has gone down the herd immunity route, but we need so this government of national unity would have, I think, to immediately do that. And then, the kinds of things which, there would have to be some unpleasant and unpalatable decisions taken about raising taxes. You don't have to go too far down that road, by the way. I mean, we can have a lot more, we can have debt, and we can live with debt at these interest rates, but we don't have panic, but we certainly have to raise taxes, and sometime in 2022 or 2023. And we have to make, the national health system and our public health system really resilient in Britain, because there could be other pandemics. Now it may be, it's more likely that that's a program of that type will be put in place by Sunak, running a Tory government of all the talents, and bringing back into government some of the very talented people who are on the back benches because they were Remainers. And I suspect he may even negotiate a much closer relationship with the customs union and the single market than Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. One way or another, there's going to be a different government. I mean, in politics, when your star starts falling, like Johnson started falling, it takes a massive jolt to reverse it. And I can't see him doing it. So I think one of those 2 things are going to happen. A government of all the talents led by Sunak, or a national government led by Sunak.
We've answered that question then. Good.
We heard it here first. And just other themes that have been coming through in the questions, Will. You talked a bit about cities and Oxfordshire, and a question came in about cities in particular, not just Oxford, but cities as a whole. And the question being, cities are there for a reason, and they're important for economic and cultural growth, and driving social mobility. But does the situation that you described in your talk, does it drive more hollowing out of city centres so that they'll only be able to be accessed by the wealthiest, and the opportunities in the least well off in the service economy?
I mean, there's a non sequitur in that question in this respect. I mean, I think if there is a hollowing out of city centres, the price of property will fall, not rise, and you may get them repopulated by artists and bohemians. I personally think that, I mean, you take a kind of, the long view of human history. I mean, cities are where they're where we associate, they're where we learn, they're where we do our culture, they're where we do the advances in health, advances in education, all the human advances are taking place in cities, and it's going to carry on. I don't believe that, but it's going to be thinned out. I think my 3.2, my 3+2, or my 4+1 is going to be the standard working week. I think there will be less pressure on rents in city centres, and I look forward to them being colonised by independent shops, independent theatres, independent recording artists, independent startups. I think the far from the rich becoming I'm much more concerned about the Cotswolds becoming the preserve of the rich than I am about the centre of Oxford.
Thanks for that. And looking more locally, again, Will, a couple of questions about specific mechanisms existing locally and how they could be used more effectively to affect positive change. Question about the local enterprise partnership and other business support agencies, and whether they're geared up well enough to support startups and the growing cooperative movement, and also related in some way, do you think an Oxfordshire bond backed by universities and the Oxfordshire councils could attract investors and raise money for infrastructure?
I think this will be the last cluster of questions.
I think the Oxford bond is an excellent idea, and you might manage to get. I mean, there are 8 very rich colleges. I mean, Hertford was the next 8. I mean, we would probably have, if the top 8 colleges had actually said, "Yep, we'll do it." I think the next 8, and Hertford would have been one of them, would have probably swung in behind that, and then you've got critical mass. You can already get the bond off the ground. So I do think that I think that's a good idea. I mean, and an important idea. I mean, because I do, again, I mean, rather like the local government. I mean, the local enterprise partnerships where, I mean, we did have, we did have a rather good network of regional development agencies. They were patchy, some were better than others. I mean, the one in Yorkshire was extremely good. The one in the southeast was less good, I recognise that. But they were abolished by Osborne and Cameron in between, smelling Sasha Swire's perfume and goofing about. They just abolished a network of development agencies. And they put in their place these, to be financed by the private sector, these LEPs, which have always been, never had the financial muscle to do much, frankly. I mean, they're not. I mean, I do, of the LEPs, I do think Oxford's got a better one, I have to say. I mean, I do think it's quite innovative, and they have tried to do some good stuff. So I'm kind of, and they, it's not a kind of helpless talking shop like some of the LEPs are around the country. So we're lucky in that respect, but it does need resource. It does need resource.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. We might have missed a couple of questions, but we hopefully have got through some of the meaty questions we've had.
We have 3 more minutes. We have 3 more minutes. We've got acres of time.
I know. For me to close the webinar, we've timed it very, very well. Thank you very much for a really interesting. It's a heavy subject. So
it's a heavy subject.
It's a heavy subject, but you've ended it on a positive. So thank you very much, and thank you for just giving us your time and your thoughts this evening. We've been really lucky. Thank you also to all of you for joining us this evening and asking really pertinent questions. Before you go, this was the first, as I mentioned before, the first CFOs of the 3 Centenary talks. I know that some of you have already signed up for tomorrow's talk on climate emergency with Dr. Freddie Otto, And on Thursday, we have the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, who will be zooming in on housing. Thank you, Tom, for writing that bit. Last couple of things. We will be posting these talks on our CFO YouTube page and website in due course, and we'll also keep you posted on other CFOs' 100th birthday celebrations over the coming months, which includes a creative writing competition on the theme community. So watch this space. Finally, thank you very much again to everyone. A particular thank you to Will. It's been great, and I think I would love to join you, by the way, in anything to do with the Youth Corps or also inclusive economy. So maybe we can carry these conversations on.
Yes, I'd like to do. I'm creating an advisory board. I want to reach out to as many people as I can. I want to make it a live issue in the local elections in May. I want to then get the social media campaign going for the kids, and I want to do this. I want to do this somewhere. I mean, it may be a bike ride. I mean, just to caught my imagination, the idea of a kind of 10, 20, 50,000, maybe 100,000 16 to 25-year-olds cycling to impress upon their elders that actually the kids are not all right, and the kids want to shout, and the kids want structures in Britain to take them into account. I think we have a bit of an obligation, frankly, and that's my view. I mean, and I'd like to enable that to happen.
Quite a few people have heard you now. You're committed. This is what a wonderful way to end this conversation.
If it doesn't, it won't be for want of trying.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Will. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and maybe see you tomorrow. Okay.
Cheers. Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.
Bye now.